The wind began before sunrise, not the usual prairie wind that whispered through grass and rattled loose boards. This one came with a low roar that sounded like a distant train rolling across the frozen plains of central Minnesota. By noon, the sky had vanished behind thick white snow. The air itself seemed to turn solid. Men later said it felt like breathing knives. On the morning of January 24, 1857, the settlers of Pine Hollow Prairie discovered something strange through the blizzard. While smoke poured endlessly from every cabin chimney in the valley, one house showed almost none at all. And yet that house was the warmest building for miles. The cabin stood on top of a tall stone barn like something built backwards. 12 feet of gray stone lifted the wooden house high above the snowdrifts. Beneath the cabin walls, cattle shifted quietly in their stalls while the storm screamed across the prairie. Inside the cabin above, children walked barefoot across warm pine floors. How that strange building stayed warm while other families nearly froze would soon change how people built homes across the frontier. But a year earlier, everyone had laughed at the man who built it. The strange house belonged to Matthias Keller. He had arrived in Minnesota the previous spring with little more than a wagon, a few tools, and the quiet stubbornness that many immigrants carried from older countries. Matthias was a tall Swiss farmer with careful hands and the slow patience of someone used to mountain winters that lasted half the year. Most settlers rushed to build their cabins as quickly as possible after claiming land. The goal was simple: put up 4 walls and a roof before the first snow arrived. Matthias did the opposite. While his neighbors raised cabins in a few short weeks, Matthias spent the entire summer digging. The work began in April of 1856 when frost still clung to the prairie soil. Each morning he walked to a rocky ridge half a mile away with his wagon and oxen. There he broke loose heavy granite stones from the ground using iron wedges and a hammer. The stones were large enough that loading a single wagon could take hours. Neighbors watched him hauling rock after rock across the prairie. At first they assumed he was building a cellar. Then the stone walls began rising. By early June the foundation already stood 8 feet high. By August it reached 12. The structure looked more like a fortress than a farmhouse. One evening a nearby farmer named Anders home rode over to watch Matthias work. Anders leaned against the fence rail, arms folded, studying the towering stone walls with a puzzled frown. "You building a church out here?" he asked. Matthias wiped sweat from his forehead and continued fitting a granite block into place. "It will be a barn," he said calmly. Anders blinked. "A barn?" Matthias nodded toward the massive stone structure. "For the animals." Anders looked again at the 12-foot walls. "That's the biggest barn basement I've ever seen." Matthias simply kept working. The truth was something none of the settlers expected. Matthias had not come to Minnesota with a new idea. He had brought an old one. In the Swiss mountains where he was raised, many families lived in what were called house barns. Livestock stayed on the lower level while families lived above them. Thick stone walls trapped heat from the animals, keeping the living space warm during brutal alpine winters. The system had worked for centuries. But on the American frontier, people believed barns and homes should always stand apart. By late summer Matthias' stone barn was complete. The walls were 18 inches thick, mortared carefully with lime he burned himself from local limestone. Small ventilation gaps were placed near the ceiling of the lower level. Above the stone walls, heavy oak beams stretched across the structure. Only then did Matthias begin building the cabin. The house itself was modest, just 20 feet wide and 30 feet long. Thick pine logs formed the walls, carefully fitted together to keep out wind, but the design looked strange. The cabin sat directly on top of the barn. By September, the structure stood alone on the prairie like some odd wooden tower rising above a stone base. Neighbors began visiting just to stare at it. One afternoon, 3 farmers gathered near the road while Matthias worked on the roof. "You see what he's doing?" one man said. "Living over cattle," another replied. "Like peasants in the old country." They shook their heads. "Animals beneath the house," one muttered. "That's filthy." Word spread quickly through the small settlement. Some settlers laughed openly when they passed by. Others simply assumed the Swiss immigrant had lost his senses. Even at church, the whispers followed Matthias and his wife Anna. "That Keller family is living above cows," one woman told another quietly. "They'll be sick all winter." Anna heard the comments but said nothing. She had grown up in the same alpine valleys as her husband. The design did not seem strange to her at all. If anything, she felt safer knowing the animals would share their warmth. By early October, the first frost coated the prairie grass. Most settlers had already stacked their winter firewood. Tall piles of split oak stood beside nearly every cabin in Pine Hollow Prairie. Carl Jensen, whose homestead lay a quarter-mile east of Matthias, had prepared nearly 20 cords of wood. "You can never have too much," he told anyone who asked. Wood was life in Minnesota winters. Without constant fires, cabins turned into iceboxes. Matthias had stacked only 6 cords. Carl noticed immediately. "You planning to freeze this winter?" he asked while riding past one afternoon. Matthias simply smiled. "The house will stay warm." Carl glanced at the tall barn below the cabin and laughed. "You think cows will heat that whole house?" "Not just cows," Matthias replied. Carl shook his head and rode away chuckling. By late October, Matthias moved his livestock into the stone barn. 6 cattle and 4 horses filled the stalls. Thick layers of straw covered the stone floor. The animals breathed clouds of warm air that rose slowly toward the wooden ceiling above them. Each animal produced a surprising amount of heat, not enough to warm open air, but inside a stone chamber with thick walls, the warmth gathered slowly, like a fire that never went out. Every evening Matthias descended to check the animals. He replaced bedding, opened small vents to allow fresh air, and ensured the barn stayed clean. The work was steady but manageable. Upstairs, the cabin slowly warmed. The first snow arrived on November 12. That night Anna noticed something. The wooden floor beneath her feet felt warm, not hot like a stove, but gently warm. Matthias smiled when she mentioned it. "The stone walls are storing the heat," he explained quietly. During the day, the animals warmed the stone foundation. At night, the thick granite slowly released that heat upward through the floorboards. The system worked exactly as he remembered from childhood. Meanwhile, across the prairie, smoke poured from every chimney. Cabin fires burned day and night. By December, the difference had become obvious. Carl Jensen split wood constantly. His hands were cracked and bleeding from the cold. The fire in his stove demanded feeding every few hours, yet the corners of his cabin still froze overnight. Meanwhile, Matthias' family used their stove mainly for cooking. Their cabin remained steady around 60 degrees even when outside temperatures fell far below zero. Neighbors noticed. They just refused to admit it. Then January arrived, and with it came the storm that would test every home on the prairie. 3 days of wind, 3 days of snow, 3 days of cold so brutal it pushed the thermometer to 40 below zero. Inside most cabins, families burned their wood piles faster than they could replace them. Fires roared. Chimneys glowed red. Furniture began disappearing into the flames. But inside the strange house built on top of a barn, the fire burned low and steady. The floor stayed warm. And for the first time, the neighbors who once laughed began to wonder if the Swiss farmer had known something they did not. By the second night of the storm, the prairie had disappeared. Snow had buried fences, wagon tracks, and the low shrubs that dotted the frozen land. The wind pushed the snow across the open country in long white rivers that never seemed to stop moving. Nothing stood still. Inside the Jensen cabin, Carl Jensen had not slept for nearly 40 hours. The stove demanded constant attention. Every time the fire dropped too low, the cold pushed into the room like an invading army. Carl fed the flames with split oak until the metal stove glowed dull red. Still, the cold crept in. His wife Ingrid sat beside the stove wrapped in 3 blankets while their 2 children slept on the floor near the fire. The rest of the cabin had turned into a freezing shadow where frost crept along the walls. Carl opened the stove door and shoved in another armful of wood. "Almost half the pile gone," Ingrid whispered. Carl said nothing. He knew the truth already. The storm had only been raging for 2 days, and they were running out of fuel. Across the prairie, the Wagner family faced the same struggle. Peter Wagner had stacked 15 cords of wood before winter arrived. He believed it would last until spring without trouble. Now he watched the pile shrink faster than he could split new logs. The problem was not just the cold. It was the wind. Every gust stole the heat from their thin wooden walls. Warm air leaked out through cracks between the logs faster than the stove could replace it. Even with the fire roaring, the far corners of the cabin remained cold enough to freeze water in a bucket. Peter sat near the stove sharpening his axe. "I'll have to cut more tomorrow," he said quietly. His wife Margaret looked toward the window where the storm hammered against the glass. "You'll freeze before you reach the trees," she said. Neither of them spoke after that, but both knew the same thought had crossed their minds. Winter had months left, and their wood might not last. While the storm punished the prairie, Matthias Keller slept peacefully above his barn. The wind still howled outside. But inside the stone foundation below the cabin, the animals shifted slowly in their straw bedding. The steady warmth from their bodies filled the thick-walled chamber like a quiet furnace. 10 animals together produced a surprising amount of heat. Each cow generated warmth through breathing and digestion. Horses did the same. Their bodies turned hay and grain into energy, releasing heat every hour of the day. Inside the sealed stone structure, that warmth had nowhere to escape quickly. The granite walls absorbed it, stored it, held it like a battery. Upstairs, the wooden floor above the barn slowly warmed. Small gaps between the floorboards allowed the rising heat to pass upward without creating strong drafts. Fresh air entered through vents near the barn floor and warmed naturally before rising into the cabin. The system required no fire, no wood, only animals living their normal lives. On the second night of the storm, Anna Keller rose from bed and walked barefoot across the cabin floor. The pine boards felt warm beneath her feet. She paused near the window and looked outside. Snow rushed sideways through the darkness. She could barely see the Jensen cabin across the prairie. Its chimney poured thick smoke into the storm. Anna returned to bed quietly. "Still warm?" Matthias asked softly. She nodded. "Yes." Matthias closed his eyes again. For him, the warmth was no surprise. He had grown up in houses just like this. The difference was that here on the American frontier, no one else believed such a design could work. On the third morning of the storm, Carl Jensen stepped outside into a world of white silence. The wind had slowed, but the cold remained brutal. His breath froze instantly in the air as he walked to the woodpile. Only a small stack remained. Carl stared at it for a long time. 2 days earlier, it had stood taller than his wagon. Now it would barely last another day. He grabbed his axe and began chopping frozen logs. The sound echoed strangely across the snow-covered prairie. Farther away, another sound reached him, soft, almost impossible to hear through the cold air. Cattle. Carl turned toward the Keller homestead. Even through drifting snow, he could see the strange stone barn with the cabin perched above it, and something else. Very little smoke came from its chimney. Carl frowned. That made no sense. Every other cabin burned fires constantly just to survive, yet Keller's chimney barely smoked at all. Carl stood for a moment staring at the distant building. Then he returned to splitting wood. By afternoon, the storm clouds finally began to break. The sky cleared slowly, revealing a pale winter sun that gave no warmth. Across Pine Hollow Prairie, settlers stepped outside their cabins to survey the damage. Snowdrifts reached the windows of some homes. Fences had vanished beneath deep white hills, but the real damage was inside the cabins. Fuel was gone. Many families had burned nearly everything they owned. Broken chairs, fence rails, even sections of wooden beds. Carl Jensen had reached that point as well. When Matthias Keller walked across the prairie that afternoon to check on his neighbors, he found Carl chopping apart the frame of a wooden chair. Carl looked up as Matthias approached. His beard was white with frost. "We're out of wood," Carl said quietly. Matthias glanced toward the empty woodpile. "How much left?" Carl nodded toward the chair pieces stacked near the stove. "That." Inside the cabin, the air felt bitterly cold despite the fire. Ingrid and the children sat wrapped in blankets near the stove. Frost coated the inside corners of the windows. Matthias studied the room carefully. The problem was obvious. The cabin could not hold heat. Every log wall leaked warmth into the frozen air outside. The fire fought constantly against physics itself. Carl followed Matthias' gaze. "You've got hardly any smoke coming from your chimney," he said slowly. Matthias shrugged. "We burn little wood." Carl stared at him. "How?" Matthias hesitated for a moment. Then he said something Carl had never expected to hear. "Come see." Carl blinked. "What?" "Bring your family," Matthias said calmly. "My house is warm." Carl laughed once, not because it was funny, because the idea sounded impossible. "You expect us to move into that barn house of yours?" Matthias met his eyes. "It will keep you warm." Carl looked back toward the stove. The chair pieces were already half gone. His children sat shivering beside the fire. Outside, the prairie stretched frozen and empty for miles. Carl slowly set the axe down. "Well," he muttered quietly, "I suppose cows can't smell worse than freezing." Half an hour later, Carl Jensen and his family crossed the snow toward the strangest house on the prairie. They stepped through the Keller cabin door expecting the smell of livestock and damp hay. Instead, they stopped in complete silence. Warm air filled the room, not the harsh heat of a stove. A steady warmth rising from the floor itself. Carl slowly removed his gloves. The wooden floor beneath his boots felt warm. Ingrid stared around the cabin in disbelief. "There's barely a fire," she whispered. Matthias nodded toward the floorboards. "The animals below are heating the stone walls." Carl looked down again. The warmth rising through the wood felt almost unreal. For the first time since the storm began, his fingers stopped shaking from the cold. And the man who had laughed the loudest at the strange barn house finally understood something important. The Swiss farmer had not built a foolish cabin. He had built the warmest home on the entire prairie. Carl Jensen stood in the center of Matthias Keller's cabin for a long moment without speaking. His hands had already begun to thaw. The deep ache in his fingers faded slowly as warmth crept back into them. He had spent the last 2 days feeding a hungry fire that never seemed to win its fight against the cold. Yet here the air felt calm and steady. Not hot, not cold, just comfortable. Ingrid Jensen stepped carefully across the wooden floor and then stopped. "Carl," she whispered. He looked down. She had removed one boot and pressed her stockinged foot against the pine boards. "It's warm." Carl stared at the floor as if it were performing a trick. No roaring fire, no iron stove glowing red, just a small cooking flame in the stone hearth. Yet the room stayed warmer than his own cabin ever had. Matthias noticed his confusion. "The heat rises slowly," he said. Carl looked up. "From the barn." Matthias nodded. "The animals warm the stone walls all day and night. The stone holds that heat, then it moves upward." Carl frowned slightly. "That's it." Matthias gave a small smile. "It is enough." Below them, the cattle shifted quietly in their stalls. Their hooves rustled through thick straw bedding. Soft breaths filled the stone chamber beneath the cabin. Carl leaned closer to the floor as if he could hear the warmth rising. "You're telling me cows are heating this whole house?" "Not just cows," Matthias replied calmly. "The stone." Carl followed him to the trapdoor near the corner of the cabin. Matthias lifted it and motioned downward. "Come see." Carl descended the wooden ladder carefully. The change in air surprised him immediately. The barn below was warm, not hot like a stable filled with lanterns and activity, but steady, comfortable. Carl removed his hat and wiped frost from his beard. "How warm is it down here?" he asked. "About 40 degrees most days," Matthias answered. Carl whistled softly. 40. "In the worst cold," Matthias said. Carl looked around. The stone walls surrounded the barn like a fortress. Thick blocks of granite held the warmth close to the animals. Their breathing filled the air with soft humidity that felt almost pleasant compared to the dry, smoke-filled air of most cabins. The smell of hay and livestock was present, but it was not overwhelming. Fresh air drifted through small vents placed along the walls. Carl studied the structure carefully. The walls were nearly 2 feet thick. "That stone must have taken months to build," he said. Matthias nodded. "Nearly the entire summer." Carl ran his hand along the cold granite surface. "Worth it," he muttered. Matthias climbed the ladder again and Carl followed him back to the cabin above. Ingrid and Anna sat at the table pouring hot tea for the children. Carl removed his coat slowly. "I think we could sleep in here tonight without the stove," he said. Anna smiled gently. "That is usually how we sleep." Carl shook his head. "All winter." "Yes." The realization settled over him slowly. Back at his own cabin, he had burned nearly 15 cords of wood since November, and still his family had nearly frozen. Matthias had burned barely a fraction of that. Carl rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "You planned all this from the beginning." Matthias nodded once. "My grandfather's house was built the same way." Carl looked around the room again. "What do you call a place like this?" "In Switzerland," Matthias said quietly, "we call it a house barn." The name sounded strange to Carl's ears, but the warmth beneath his feet made the idea suddenly seem very sensible. Later that evening, another visitor arrived through the snow. Peter Wagner had seen the Jensen family leaving their cabin earlier in the afternoon. Curiosity pushed him across the prairie. When Peter stepped inside the Keller cabin, he stopped instantly. His cheeks flushed red as warmth hit his frozen skin. "Good Lord," he muttered. Carl looked up from the table. "You should feel the floor." Peter bent down and touched the wood. "Well, I'll be," he said quietly. Matthias explained the design again. The animals, the stone foundation, the slow rising heat. Peter listened carefully. "You're telling me that heat just keeps rising all night?" "Yes." "And the stone holds it?" "Yes." Peter leaned back in his chair. "I've burned nearly 10 cords this winter already," he said. Carl snorted. "Try 15. Peter looked around again. "And you've used what, 5? 4, Matthias replied. Peter let out a low whistle. For a long moment the men sat silently listening to the wind fade outside. The storm had nearly passed, but the lesson it carried had only begun. That night 2 families slept inside the Keller cabin. Children stretched out on blankets near the warmest part of the floor. Adults rested along the walls. No one needed heavy coats. The warmth rose slowly through the pine boards all night long. Downstairs the cattle shifted in their straw bedding. Their breathing filled the stone barn with steady warmth that continued its quiet climb toward the cabin above. When morning arrived, the fire in the hearth had nearly died out. Yet the room remained warm. Carl woke first. He walked barefoot across the floor and shook his head in disbelief. "Still warm," he whispered. Matthias simply nodded. Later that day, the Jensens and Wagners returned to their own homes, but something had changed. The strange Swiss barn house no longer seemed foolish. It seemed practical. The rest of the winter proved it again and again. While other settlers fought constant battles with their stoves, Matthias Keller lived comfortably above his barn. The animals warmed the stone warmed the floor, and the floor warmed the house. By spring, the story had spread far beyond Pine Hollow Prairie. People began riding long distances just to see the unusual building. Farmers studied the stone foundation carefully. They asked questions about ventilation, about floor gaps, about how many animals were needed to warm a house. Matthias answered them patiently, because he knew something the frontier was slowly learning. Sometimes survival did not come from new inventions. Sometimes it came from old knowledge brought across an ocean. And on the frozen prairies of Minnesota, that old knowledge had just proven its worth. When spring finally arrived in Pine Hollow Prairie, it did not come gently. The snow began melting all at once. Frozen fields turned to dark mud. Streams of water ran through the prairie grass, cutting narrow channels toward the distant river. Wagon wheels sank deep into the thawing ground, and the air filled with the smell of wet soil and livestock. But the biggest change that spring was not the weather. It was the way people talked about Matthias Keller. Only a few months earlier, his strange house had been a joke shared at church gatherings and supply runs to town. Settlers had whispered about the odd Swiss farmer who lived above his cows like a man from another century. Now those same people rode out to his homestead almost every week. They came with notebooks, with measuring ropes, with questions. Carl Jensen arrived first. One bright morning in April, he walked across the yard carrying a folded piece of paper. "I've been thinking about rebuilding my place," he said. Matthias looked up from repairing a fence rail. "The cabin." Carl nodded. "The whole thing." He unfolded the paper and revealed a rough sketch of a building. It looked very familiar. Stone walls below, cabin above, a barn beneath the living space. Matthias studied the drawing carefully. "You will need thick stone," he said. Carl nodded. "I know. The walls must hold the heat." "I figured as much." Matthias pointed to another section of the sketch. "The ventilation is important too. Fresh air must enter low and rise slowly." Carl tapped the paper with his finger. "That's why I came to you." For the next hour, the two men stood beside the barn discussing details. Stone thickness, floor spacing, drainage for the livestock bedding. Carl wrote everything down. "I burned 18 cords of wood last winter," he admitted finally. Matthias raised his eyebrows slightly. Carl shrugged. "And nearly froze anyway." Matthias said nothing. Carl folded the paper again. "I'd rather build something that works." A few days later, Peter Wagner arrived with the same idea. His sketch was even rougher than Carl's. "I want to try something smaller," Peter said. "Maybe 6 cattle underneath." "That will still help," Matthias replied. Peter looked toward the stone barn. "Your walls are what, 18 inches thick?" "Yes." Peter shook his head slowly. "That's a lot of rock." Matthias smiled faintly. "But it holds the heat." Peter nodded. "That storm convinced me." Soon other settlers began asking questions too. Not everyone planned to rebuild their homes immediately, but many wanted to understand the idea. Word spread quickly through nearby settlements. A Norwegian family building a new homestead west of Pine Hollow rode 3 hours just to examine the Keller barn. 2 German immigrants arrived a week later carrying measuring tools. Even travelers passing through the region stopped to look at the strange structure. Most of them asked the same question. "Does it really stay warm?" Matthias usually answered the same way. "You may stand on the floor if you wish." The warmth spoke for itself. By early summer, construction began across the prairie. Carl Jensen started first. His original cabin was torn down piece by piece. The logs were reused for the upper level of his new home, but the foundation was completely different. For weeks, Carl and his sons hauled granite stones from the same rocky ridge Matthias had used. The work was slow. Each stone had to be fitted carefully, each layer mortared properly. Sometimes neighbors stopped to watch the progress. One afternoon, Peter Wagner leaned on the fence beside the construction site. "That wall must weigh 20 tons already," he said. Carl wiped sweat from his face. "Good." Peter grinned. "You finally believe in thick stone." Carl laughed. "After last winter." He shook his head. "I believe in anything that keeps my children warm." Peter began his own construction later that summer. His design was smaller than Carl's but followed the same principles. Stone below, cabin above, livestock underneath. Within a year, 3 new house barns stood across Pine Hollow Prairie, each one slightly different, but all built from the same simple idea. Capture the heat that already exists, store it, use it slowly. Matthias watched the changes quietly. He never bragged about his design. In fact, he often reminded people that the idea was far older than him. "My grandfather lived this way," he would say, "and his father before him." Still, the settlers of Minnesota had learned the lesson in a hard way. They had nearly frozen before they understood it. The benefits of the house barn soon became obvious beyond winter. During the hot months of summer, the thick stone foundation kept the cabin floors cool. While other homes grew stifling under the sun, the Keller cabin remained comfortable. The stone worked both ways, holding warmth in winter, holding coolness in summer. Farmers also noticed another advantage. Animals kept beneath the cabin stayed healthier. The stone barn protected them from brutal wind and cold. Livestock burned less energy trying to stay warm. They ate less hay. They gained more weight. The animals helped warm the house, and the house helped protect the animals. It was a system that worked both directions. By the late 1850s, the design had begun spreading across other settlements in Minnesota and Wisconsin. Travelers carried the story. A Swiss farmer had built a strange barn house. People laughed. Then a terrible winter came, and the warmest house on the prairie was the one built above cows. Newspapers occasionally mentioned the design in small articles about frontier survival techniques. Some settlers adapted the idea in simpler ways. A few built partial basements for livestock. Others experimented with stone foundations that stored heat even without animals. Not every attempt succeeded. Some builders skipped important details like ventilation or drainage. Those houses often developed problems with moisture or poor air circulation. But when built correctly, the system proved remarkably effective. Years later, people in Pine Hollow Prairie still remembered the winter of 1857. They remembered the storm that nearly killed several families. They remembered burning furniture and fence posts to keep their fires alive. And they remembered the strange house that stayed warm while others froze. Carl Jensen often told the story himself. He would stand beside his rebuilt house barn and laugh. "I used to call that design foolish," he admitted. Then he would stamp his boot against the warm floorboards of his cabin. "Turns out cows make better heaters than stoves." Matthias Keller rarely joined those conversations. He preferred quiet work around his farm. But sometimes visitors asked him one final question. Why had he trusted the old design when everyone else doubted it? Matthias usually answered in a simple way. Because winter does not care about opinions. He would look across the prairie toward the distant tree line where snowstorms often gathered. Winter only respects good shelter. And on the frozen frontier of Minnesota, one Swiss farmer had remembered a lesson that others had forgotten. Sometimes the best way to survive a harsh new land was to bring the old wisdom with you.